Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to Cultivate. We're really excited. We're at not the beginning, but we're near the beginning of this new season, and it's also election season. Now, when you hear those words, and especially if you live in the state of Pennsylvania, what that means is that every advertisement that you see is mainly pointed at the election, because I think the only meaningful election in the country is now happening in Pennsylvania. So I expect to have a picnic where, like Tim Walz and J.D. Vance actually show up at my house by accident together. So it's kind of hot and heavy here. So today what we wanted to do was to talk with you as parents about what we're doing in classical Christian education to prepare our students to think thoughtfully about politics. And that's really challenging these days. And I have two guests here. One is someone that you're going to be very familiar with. Even, he's just a regular, and that's Graham Dennis, our Dean of Students. Hey, Graham.
Hi, Ty.
So good to see you today. The other one, though, this is your inaugural...
First
time, yeah.
Very political of you, Ty.
Yeah, thank you.
His
I know.
address.
Yeah. I was thinking about how smart I was there. Gordon Denlinger, the Honorable Gordon Denlinger. He's honorable not just because he is honorable, but because he actually served for many years in the 99th District of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. So we're going to talk about politics and especially about rhetoric and really try to help you as parents know what we do and also help you prepare you for perhaps rhetorically woeful practice of politics in our country. If you have watched any of the debates, I'm still looking for some way to block out most of those memories. But I've not found it yet. So first off, I want you to get to know our guests today. Tell us a little bit about your experience in politics, your use of rhetoric, or both. Graham might lean more on the rhetoric, Gordon on the politics. So we'll start with Representative Denlinger.
Thank you, Ty, and it's great to be here with you and with Graham today. Thrilled to share some thoughts and enjoy some conversation. By background, I have had sort of a dual career track, predominantly being a financial accounting person. I'm a CPA, certified public accountant by background.
Does that make your time in government more depressing because you understand the numbers of what you're doing better than I would?
Well, I found that it opened amazing doors of opportunity because obviously taxes, revenues, all that are central to what government does, but it does bring realism to the weight of those issues. But most of my career has been in the finance and accounting realm, ending as a corporate controller. I went into advocacy at the state level as the state director of NFIB, National Federation of Independent Business. So during the pandemic,
there are still independent businesses in Pennsylvania?
There are indeed, and 13,000 were members of my organization, over 300,000 nationally. And then for the last 4 years, I'm currently serving as the Deputy Auditor General. We elect 5 offices statewide that are non-judicial, those being the governor, lieutenant governor, treasurer, attorney general, and auditor general. And I am one of 3 deputies serving under our auditor general, and I have been honored to do that for now in my 4th year currently.
Okay.
So some business, some politics.
So, okay, since this person is elected, and here in Pennsylvania, of course, you have to flip a coin to see which party is going to win. That's why it's so interesting.
We are a swing state.
We are. Boy, we know it, don't we? But are you working for a Republican or a Democrat, or in the Auditor General's office? Does that really, do party politics really matter? How much do they matter?
It absolutely matters.
Okay.
And Tim DeFore, our current Auditor General, is a Republican elected in 2020, but he's up for re-election currently. So this is that season. And we are, by virtue of being an independent branch of the executive, we are independent for auditing purposes as well. So that gives us that separation,
so
if you will.
Governor Shapiro can't send you what he wants your numbers to be.
No, he cannot. and that's
Could Governor
very
Governor Rendell do that? Because he was a little bit sneakier, I think.
No, none of them can, and it's important that we keep that separation in place.
Thank you. The separation of powers, long may it reign. So, Graham, tell us a little bit about you've never held political office,
No,
have you?
unless you consider Dean of Students to be a political
Well,
office.
some days it is. You and I both know that. But you do teach rhetoric here, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I've taught rhetoric for years, and obviously one of the things we're going to discuss today is the relationship between rhetoric and politics. And one thing I love about the way we teach rhetoric is we include the historical perspective. So it's interesting that, Aristotle and Quintilian both thought rhetoric essential sciences, especially in relationship to politics.
Yes.
So there's a long history of that relationship. So we do, of course, teach. Our rhetoric class is really like a communications, like a speech class. And
right.
So in a lot of ways, it's similar to the class that you might have taken at a public high school. However, we include in it the history of rhetoric, examples from the history of rhetoric, and just especially classical rhetoric. And it's really fascinating to get some perspective. And one thing you learn is that ugliness in political discourse, there is nothing new under
I was
the
going to
sun.
say when people say, "Man, this media, they just don't tell the truth." Most of the newspapers were completely political for so many years, and it's horrifying to look back and to see some of the stuff that made it into print back in days when we just imagine everything being serene and peaceful.
We've never had the issue of the coarsening of political discourse. Do you remember who Andrew Jackson was?
Oh, yes. Yes.
And the election of 1800, Jefferson versus Adams was particularly just awful.
Jefferson, he was sneaky. And Adams was not, and both led to bad things. So many times, and this happens a lot of times when I'm talking to grandparents, and they'll say something like, "Why are so many people, especially so many young people, cynical about politics?" So, and sometimes I say to them, "Well, who made them this way? Like, have we done things that would make them cynical?" And I usually think the answer is yes, we have done things that could make us cynical. But why, when you're thinking about that, and as church leaders, both of you are elders, why should we as believers avoid that sin of cynicism that leads to apathy?
Wow, that's a great question. And
how do we accomplish it?
When I look at cynicism, typically it's driven by disappointment over outcomes and realities. I see that in folks who, like me, have some gray hair and are miles down the road, but it's usually driven by a misalignment of expectation over what, in this case, government can and should be doing and what it actually is doing. When I see cynicism in a young person, I'm really burdened because, when we're young, we should dream the big dreams. We should have the hopes and aspirations. And I see that a parent or grandparent has really done a number, if you will, on a young person. And to the extent that we're speaking to parents today, I would challenge us all to take a step back and realize that, yes, we can burden the next generation with the problems that are there. There's plenty to look at, but are we killing off that hopefulness, those dreams that are there, and potential involvement to take us to a better place?
Right. Anything to add to that, Graham?
Yeah, I would say I think it's actually quite simple. I think one of the main reasons for cynicism is it's very common for people to be interested in politics only when it comes to the election season. But the act of governing, which is very different than the act of getting elected, is boring. It's not interesting. So, how invested are people in what's actually going on in the act of governance, right? It's boring. It's not going to make the headlines. I'm sure a lot of what
no one reads the headlines, even if it made it
Correct.
To the headlines.
A lot of what Gordon does is obviously, in one sense, boring and yet absolutely essential for the functioning of the state.
Yes.
And so the challenge is, if you get involved in local politics, for instance, you'll start to see what governing looks like. But if you're only interested in politics during the election season, then what you're going to think is you're going to confuse getting elected with governing. And they're very distinct. In governing, for instance, I'm a conservative. I believe in institutions. What concerns me is conservatives are institutionalists. We believe that society is worth living in because we have good institutions.
That's why we have Edmund Burke's picture.
Exactly, right? But the cynicism comes, I think, especially from not only not believing in institutions, but just not believing in governing.
Yes.
Confusing getting elected with governing.
So in today's politics, though, oftentimes seems to be a lot more heat than light, okay? So the recent debates might be horrifying pictures of that, where we're arguing about golf scores and pets in small Ohio towns.
And attendance at rallies.
Yes. That's crucially important to... No, it's not. It's not important to government. But Quintilian... And of course, in classical education, in the 7 liberal arts, they wanted to produce students who were prepared to step into government because they had a picture. They wanted a society where the people were governing themselves. The free people were free, and they didn't have a king over them many times. So Quintilian said that I think his definition of rhetoric, Mr. Dennis, is a good man speaking well or speaking truth. So by preparing students to be that, are they going to be prepared to step into the politics of our day? Or is that too erudite and thoughtful? And does that mean that they're going to be tossed to the trash heap as they try to get into politics?
I'm going to defer first to Gordon just because he has firsthand experience of
both winning elections and getting tossed on the...
both sides, absolutely.
You've ridden the Bronco and
gotten thrown from the Bronco. That's true. Our discourse has certainly coarsened. We all acknowledge that, and we are pained as we see that. To the question, though, could and should a young person who's trained classically in the disciplines of rhetoric, who is well skilled and abled, still venture in? Yes, absolutely, because ultimately I believe that the communication of truth in a clear and structured manner does win the day. The fact that we're seeing some abysmal examples currently doesn't replace the fact that I believe people yearn to be respected intellectually, and when that is presented to them, it's going to be a breath of fresh air. They're going to have things to think on, chew over, wrestle with, talk with friends and neighbors, talk within their families, and really elevate the whole dialogue. And do we ever need that? We need that right now.
Yeah. It's always thinking about the debates that are going on now, and then, some of our reading gets around the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and so different. And we're going to talk a little bit about how technology has really impacted that. But, there are places in the Lincoln-Douglas debates where Lincoln would say, that's a very good question, and I know everyone's hungry, so let's go, we'll dismiss for 2 hours. You can go home and then come back, and I'll be ready to respond to this. So there's a lot more work that was going in then to the kind of deep thinking that really maybe spurs on not just good government, but the kind of investment that young people can have with the dreams of making a more perfect union, as our founders said.
Yeah, and I would just add one little. I think what you were getting at is also, this sort of Machiavellian question. If rhetoric is a good man speaking well, are you just throwing someone to wolves who's not going to be able to operate or function, sheep amongst wolves? And Jesus, of course, says that we should be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So I think that the caricature of Quintilian's quote is that a good man speaking well is naive. The Machiavellian caricature is, well, if you're a good man speaking well, you're just going to get trampled.
Yes.
And to Gordon's point, but people want good men speaking well. They desperately want that. And you can see that in a political season. The person who appears, we use that word gravitas now, right? Like, the idea is that we want someone who we would say can reflect our situation back to us, can tell us not just what we want to hear, but assess the situation. And if you think of a military metaphor, you want someone in charge who can tell you what's happening and articulate back to you what the plan is. And I think people still desperately want that.
Yes.
So, it doesn't mean that you have to be only innocent as doves. One can be shrewd. But you take someone like Churchill or Reagan, masters of rhetoric, but very shrewd tacticians.
Yes.
Just to add a thought to that, and I think that as we look at, who rises to the top, and, I think of the example, and I do not watch them because I attend worship on Sunday mornings, but the Sunday morning news shows, and who gets invited back, who becomes a regular. It's the folks who can, take the arguments and present them, folks who have, the ability to speak clearly, speak to the issues, and little by little, the process winnows out folks who are less capable. I do see that happening. Also, though, and
you do?
I'm acknowledging that in the current context, sometimes noise does carry the day.
Right.
But typically, it works its way out.
Yeah. So when we look back in time, and we want to show young men and women, we want to give them, Lewis would say in The Abolition of Man, the taste for the right things, right? So we want them to look back in politics, and we don't want them to just think that let's imagine that we have a political debate where nothing really substantive is said. We want to point them to have a higher vision sometimes for this. Who would you point them back to? Who are some of your favorites, and why?
Well, I'll jump in there. You mentioned Churchill. We all have to just stand back in respect for the man, and notable is how rehearsed and practiced he was, even with his casual, off-the-cuff remarks. Mm-hmm. He was a writer by profession. He declared that that's what he was. And so the spoken and written word were central to, his mission. But Churchill just stands, taking the nation of Britain through the darkest hours of World War II. We just stand in respect of Winston Churchill always. For me personally, Reagan, of course, is right there. He's the gentleman who got me interested as a teenager in politics. So I'm dating myself a little, and how he would weave a little humor into the making of an argument and how that would just connect with people. He was from the movie biz. He knew how to deliver a line. And, of course, the GE role as a national spokesman. He was well practiced to take on the mission of elective office.
Well, and he sharpened his tools for 30 years, really.
Absolutely.
This is someone who was honing that ability. But the even more impressive part maybe was to recognize he didn't have a Republican majority in the House and Senate. He had to figure out how to give and take.
He did, and his ability to speak to the nation and have the nation contact Congress back in the early 80s to advance his agenda, they did. They dialed, they wrote, they sent messages to Congress, and Congress got on board.
Yeah.
To your point, with a minority of his own party. I'll throw out two more that have impressed me over time. The Kennedy brothers, had amazing stage presence. They were well grounded in Western civilization through their New England boarding school backgrounds and Harvard, so forth. But a Kennedy speech was always an event, and stage presence was there. And I've read various books on background, but it was always said that because of their Roman Catholic background, that they understood ceremony and how important that was in public space. So that is, something I reflect on. And then beyond that, I'll throw out an outlier, Mario Cuomo, who was the governor of New York State. And I recall speeches he gave at Democratic conventions where he spoke to the heart of the nation to move people on social policy, particularly the welfare state, if you will, but really calling people to look out for those who were downtrodden and oppressed. And he was a powerful orator in that context.
He wouldn't have been on the top of my mind, but I remember some of those speeches. And even though I didn't agree with his political position sometimes, a powerful orator.
Agree. And
anybody you want to add to the list, Graham?
Two funny ones, because we don't typically think of them as being politicians, but Socrates and Jesus. Gotta say Jesus, right?
It's always the right answer.
Yeah.
Graham.
So just to maybe a little bit from left field here, but one of the things I would say about both Socrates and Jesus is they obviously often had to speak to hostile audiences. And one of the most interesting things about both of them is their ability to speak to hostile audiences while retaining a kind of magnanimous character. And if we expand the word political to mean what it meant in the ancient sense, it's sort of an understanding of the whole, right? It's human beings looking over the whole and assessing the whole. How do things relate together? And so Socrates in the Apology gives this speech, and he at the time would have been the enemy of the state. And who on earth thinks of Socrates as the enemy in the Apology, right? He's the hero.
Right.
And so, but he was the enemy of the state at that point.
I don't know. I think we did have one student last year who was making an argument that sounded something like he's the enemy.
Yeah,
of the
right,
state.
yeah. And Jesus, of course, when he engaged his enemies, there's this incredible quality of having intensity, and yet, on the other hand, somehow not coming down to the level. I mean, what we're seeing in politics right now in the coarsening is an inability to find that delicate balance between intensity and a commitment to the truth, and then just not playing fair.
Yes.
And so what you
But
see...
now, how do you square that with brood of vipers and sons of the... Oh, yes, because your father isn't Abraham, like you say. It's the devil.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think one of the things that's really neat when you look at classical rhetoric is the three parts of rhetoric. One of those three parts is ethos. It's how your character is perceived. And one of the reasons why Jesus could get away with that is his ethos was so incredible.
Yes.
So Reagan could look in the camera and refer to communism as evil. Mm-hmm. But his ethos, his magnanimity and his ethos was so incredible that you didn't feel like he was name calling.
Sure.
So our kids watch Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech.
I was gonna add King to the list.
I was going to mention King as well. And the thing that's interesting, radically, Reagan and King are utterly different speakers, but they both had hostile audiences at many times when they were speaking. And one of the things that they both did incredibly, I'll just use the example of, Reagan's famous "Mr. Gorbachev, take down that wall," Berlin Wall address is, he's standing, he's got, bulletproof glass behind him. And if you listen to the speech, I think from modern standards, we might think of it as a little boring. He gives the history of the Marshall Plan. But what's really incredible about the speech is the mixture of intensity and passion and also calmness and magnanimity. And he's basically saying, get behind me, follow. And as a kid, like Gordon, I wanted to follow Reagan. You know,
Yeah.
I wanted to get behind him, but he didn't scream and yell and, you know, so you, like, how did Jesus deliver those words? You know, brood of vipers, you know, was he foaming at the mouth or was there this kind of calmness and magnanimity? And I suspect quite often, you know,
If you're Scots-Irish, he was foaming at the mouth, I'm pretty sure.
right. So yeah, and Martin Luther King Jr., it's funny when I'm talking to the students about that speech, I always try to say to them, you know, a black Southern preacher, you're not probably going to get away with trying to deliver a speech
Sure.
like that. He has a cadence.
Well,
Or
you should just say you can't pull it off.
right, you can't pull. Don't try to.
Don't try to
MLK.
mimic. Yeah.
But the other thing that's interesting in both Reagan and King that I think I try to teach my students is, as Gordon said with Churchill, there's this incredible commitment to language.
Yes.
How things are put. And when you speak well, a good man speaking well, it's not only that you respect his character and you want to listen to what he has to say, but you remember his words. And, you know, Reagan's speeches, King's speeches, you know, and you think of some of the other, you know, obviously Lincoln, the words are also, they last.
Yes.
And I think that's what we're kind of sad about is our discourse. It just seems so shallow.
We have a poverty of banality at this point, right? But the thing that it so strikes me about King's "I Have a Dream" speech, we live in a politics of the banal, like the just uncouth, slothful, awful language, right? We also live in a time of envy, right? Where really a lot of politics is a politics of envy. And what King does in his speech, in the I Have a Dream speech, that's so different, it catches me every time, is he's basically not arguing some terrible things were being done in America. To the people that he was speaking to on that mall, and he was trying to lift their eyes up, to lift the country up, and to say, let's be true Americans. Let's make America a place that lives up to its values, right?
Appealing to the better angels of their nature, as Lincoln would say.
Well, but in very plain language too. And this is one of the things that I want to make sure, Graham, that I thought when I was growing up, that you studied rhetoric so you could use great big words like William F. Buckley and I
was going to mention Buckley as one of my heroes.
Well,
I'm right there with you.
Yeah. But if any of us tried to talk like Buckley, we'd fall on our faces, because I would be using that rhetoric to prove to everyone how smart I am. When Martin Luther King talks about the failure of America to live up to the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created
Great
equal.
check metaphor.
Yes, he says, you wrote us a bad check. And I'm like, that's
And I
palpable
don't
language.
believe the Bank of Justice is empty.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. But if you look back to Churchill, very different style. But I remember learning so much from studying his rhetoric, because if there was an Anglo-Saxon word, he would choose that over a Latinate word, because he wanted to grab your gut. And he knew what kind of language, and he would use small words instead of large words. And boy, you see that in that kind of powerful rhetoric. And I'm going to add one more to my list, which is this last summer I got to go on a trip and went to Athens. And, you know, when you get to Athens, you think about Pericles, you know, and it just hit me as I was watching some political, and I don't think it was the candidates, it was people talking about the candidates. But in the funeral oration, there's so many things that Pericles could say, and instead he says, this city is worth fighting for. It is worth dying for. So instead of just looking at the dead bodies instead of just praising those people, he lifts people up. So it's really important. Well, and as we're going to prepare young men and women to go out into the world, into places like politics, like the law, right? Or even to make decisions about voting. Why is that understanding of the power of rhetoric so important?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a range of professions, and probably there's almost no occupation where having a good grounding in rhetorical abilities and skills is not going to take you on up the ladder, as they say, to move you forward in a significant way. But particularly in politics, here again, the ability intellectually to structure communications, to speak to people. And you mentioned Churchill not using the biggest word available and using the appropriate words. I think his speeches are crafted, and that's an art, certainly.
Yes.
The calling is to get to those words that absolutely connect with the individuals that you're trying to address, speak to their needs, speak to their aspirations, as King did, speak to their higher ideals and call them to a better place. There is such a need for that.
Do you know the story of his invention of that phrase, the Iron Curtain? Have you ever heard of that?
I thought that went back to Truman giving an address in Missouri, or Churchill and Truman traveling to Missouri. It was Churchill. You are correct.
Right. But my understanding before they left for Missouri, or maybe it was in Missouri, he was just pacing at night. He did as Churchill. We always wonder when we read about Churchill how this man was sober enough to stand up sometimes, because he was a prodigious, not as prodigious as the Russians, but he was a prodigious drinker. But I think he had a bottle, a flask of bourbon, and was just walking back and forth in his bedroom trying to come up with this phrase. It's like he was just playing with a wall of darkness, a shade of darkness, and he as he walks back and forth. And I think the story comes from the butler, who's standing there trying to get him another bottle probably. But he says, an iron curtain has descended across Europe. And he knows that he has it. He has the phrase. And of course that phrase is stuck with us until today. But we live in an age where a lot of times what we want to prepare young men and women to do is to tell the truth powerfully, okay? We live in an age, though, that usually uses language differently than that. They often use it histrionically. So I'm going Buckley now, or they use it to obscure rather than to clarify truth. So does it bother? I think every day now I hear democracy is on the ballot. Okay? And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that our Constitution, it was made for times like this. And I'm not trying to diminish because I think there's a vast difference. I think there's a greater worldview difference now than there was at the time of the Civil War. But how do we help students navigate, or how do we help parents navigate with students this language of overstatement, maybe?
Democracy is on the ballot is, to me, a very hollow statement. It really...
I'm worried that democracy left the building a while back.
Well, how far down the road are we truly?
Yeah.
And I, pardon me, still consider us a constitutional republic, but all that to say, some use the term representative democracy. Ultimately, though, I think that's a phrase to generate a response, be that emotionally driven, to put people in a panic and, oh my, we have to get off the sofa and go do things, whatever those things are. Ultimately, I think taking a step back from hyperbolic statements has to happen. And, we need to look at the longer view. And I know in classical ed, you're presenting, the historical long view.
Yes.
And that calms down, the rise in blood pressure, because frankly, we look at it in, the realm of God's sovereignty, and God in Romans 13:1 indicating that he puts people into positions of authority, which by default means he removes them out as well, and place our trust in an all-wise, all-powerful, sovereign creator. So I think coming back to maybe that as a first principle can take us away from the political ad that's generated to create a response.
Yeah.
I think there's also, we live in a consumerist society, and I think one of the challenges is helping to model for kids. I mean, there is so much clickbait. One of the reasons why they're cynical is they're thinking, politics is a form of advertisement. So there's a lot of clickbait. There's a lot of podcasts, this one not being one of them, that are constructed to get people to listen through hyperbole.
Yes.
And so I think one thing parents can do is just model the ability to have a sort of dispassionate conversation about political matters. We also have to be careful that we're not always yelling. The Chicken Little, kids don't want to hear. I remember when I was growing up in the 80s, one of the things that was great about Reagan is we were feeling like, okay, bomb shelters, the nuclear clocks at, 11:59. And, you're feeling like the world's falling apart. And then to have someone in a sort of calm, dispassionate manner tell you the way the world is, it's so comforting. And I think that's part of the challenge is that parents have to model that for their children.
Yes.
You show your children what a calm, dispassionate conversation looks like. I think that's what Al Mohler does so well. Like his briefing, it's just almost like a machine gun. And it's very dispassionate and matter of fact. And I think that's part of the brilliance of Al is just, kind of reporting the facts. Yeah. Even when he feels passionate about something, you don't feel like a lot of, heat and not a lot of light.
Yeah. So. There's, and just thinking back to Reagan, and I remember that the characteristic of being confident enough that you're in what you're saying, that you can say it with good humor to someone who disagrees, and the power of that, which we're old enough to remember back to the second Mondale Reagan debate, where Reagan's age was an issue, which has been an issue recently in politics. But when Reagan came out and said something like, "I'm not going to hold my opponent's relative youth and inexperience against him."
Yeah. So I have my William F. Buckley socks on. You guys can't see this.
Wow!
I actually have my Buckley.
I'm thankful we can't.
Yeah, right. They're peach too. So anyway, but one of the things about firing line that's so incredible is he would be, debating Chomsky or Gore Vidal and really intense. And he just had he's leaning back, in this very kind of casual manner, and he'd crack a joke. And here's some of the most important questions of our time being discussed. And I remember one thing that struck me is I didn't like Noam Chomsky. Now, I don't think I knew a lot about Chomsky at the time.
You probably like him less now.
Yeah, right. Definitely now that but what I didn't like, partly about what I didn't like about Chomsky, is I don't ever remember seeing him laugh.
Yes.
Buckley would just laugh, and he had this kind of casual quality and crack a joke, and Chomsky just kind of like a tank, just trying to, bulldoze. So I do think there's a sense in which that's part of the magnanimity. That's part of the, if you can model this for your children, that I'm, the sky is falling, and then you can actually model with your children. I think here's a real danger that we're experiencing right now is that our political discourse is not only coarsened, but both parties are trying to radicalize. And conservatism is not radical.
Sure.
It's trying to conserve. It's trying to build. It's farming. It's composting.
Recognizing that there are precious things.
Right.
Precious things that need to be protected. And those precious things, like family, like marriage, those things they're not divisive. I'm not sure that's the case all the time, but a lot of the things that are worth protecting are much more prosaic than they are, vast. They're not clickbait. They're just without which we don't flourish. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Graham, you mentioned Al Mohler, and he's, by the way, he recorded the briefing at this table. Maybe we should call this the Mohler table here in my office. But he recorded the briefing, and amazingly, I thought he had a team of people that wrote things up, and they'd be scrolling text. He just cut stories out of the paper and redlines them, and then just speaks. Mm-hmm. I do have some jealousy, at least. I'm hoping I don't have envy at that point, but I'm that's it. It's a skill that is a few standard deviations beyond the normal. And what's amazing about that is he gets those powerful words down right. Now, he got to go and talk to our students, and one of the most encouraging things that has been said about our students here at Veritas, they asked some really good questions that day. He said, "Finally, I see reinforcements." Okay, that was. I think I'd like to just put that, we
need a sign,
right? No, we need like a billboard or something. But why is it, Graham, that rhetoric? How do we train students in rhetoric, and why is it so important that it's at this kind of capstone of classical Christian education?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer to that is developmentally, it's a mature skill. It's not a skill you expect a kindergartner to have. I mean, yeah, some precocious kindergartners may have that skill, but it's a skill that developmentally occurs pretty late. I remember as an 8th grader, first time I ever got up to speak, my ears were red. I probably had a zit. I was worried about what people are thinking. I don't remember a single thing I said. I was terrified. And you kind of grow into a confidence that really, even when you graduate high school is the beginning. That's the kind of skills that we think of as related to rhetoric are mature skills. And so an education also should have a trajectory, and memorization, wanting to argue, those skills are valuable and important. But the ability to communicate well and confidently is a pretty mature skill. Mm-hmm. And what you see with someone like Churchill, for instance, is it takes a lot of life too.
Yes,
a lot of lived life to get to that point. So one of the goals of our education is to have a trajectory where 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, they're starting to develop a skill that they're already, as Dorothy Sayers says, they're naturally oriented towards wanting to communicate well. Mm-hmm. But I think what our culture hasn't done is to recognize it's not only a desire that a small percentage of the population has. Everyone wants to communicate well. We have different ability levels, but everyone wants to communicate well. So my son, who's an engineer, graduating, had an internship this summer, civil engineer, construction management, civil engineering, and the last thing he had to do was to present. He had a presentation in front of, all the most important people in the company. And for him, he said it actually was pretty easy. And because it's, engineers, CPAs, everyone needs to be able to communicate well. Husbands, wives, So the art of communicating well is just it's just part of adult life. It's part of our maturity, and it's a natural sort of capstone to a student's education, because what we're doing is this is education for citizenship.
Yes.
We're trying to make good citizens, which is part of what Quintilian meant when he said, what is rhetoric? A good man speaking well. We're making citizens. Mm-hmm. And so we want our students to function well as mature adults in their society.
And they're always, when we stress test them with things like senior thesis presentations and stuff like that, they are always really excited and happy about that all the time.
Love it.
They love it, We had another friend here yesterday, and I was introducing him to our senior thesis teacher, Caroline Nixon, and I said, for a short time each year, she's the most hated person in the school, because when senior thesis is coming down to the end, it is stressful.
Yes, it is.
But what's interesting is after that stress test, they're ready for a lot of things. Yeah.
No, to Graham's excellent points there, when a young person comes through the classical educational model, through Veritas or similar programs that are out there, they're going to get the grounding in the three persuasive audience appeals that Aristotle presented: logos, pathos, and ethos, which we've referred to earlier. The classical Roman model of the five canons of rhetoric are going to be taught to give that finishing and that polishing that's going to prepare them to graduate and head out into society, civil engineering, CPA, whatever occupation is there, and certainly in the public square, be that on a school board, be that running for state rep, governor, or president of the United States, wherever God directs that young person, they will have the foundational skills. They will have been trained properly to formulate, use the wordsmithing that's there, formulate the arguments, present truth. So essential, present truth in a God-honoring way, and that is what our society needs. It's the call of the hour.
Yeah.
And just a quick little, the Christian dimension of this is, the apologetic task is to be prepared to give an answer. And the way that Peter frames that is, we need to be winsome. When the moment comes when someone says, why do you have hope? Explain to me why you have hope. At that point, there is the ability to winsomely, for me to be able to present the truth of Christianity winsomely. So there's that political dimension, but there's also that theological dimension that, I should be able to say why I have hope in Christ.
Right. As we come near the end here, there is rhetoric or types of rhetoric that are used now, mainly because of technology. So instead of the Lincoln Douglas debates being at in a big tent, right, with people that are committed to being there for hours and hours, we have 30-second answers or 90-second answers, or people trying to make Tic Toks, which sometimes are found persuasive. I'm pretty sure that democracy can't function, a republic can't function that way. But we've been opening up more and more. Graham, you teach Aristotle's Politics, and he doesn't have a lot of good things to say about democracy. Yeah. And I worry that what we grew up in, most of us are around 50, what we grew up in was a democratic republic where not everything was on display. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill didn't set up a camera to watch them have lunch and to find those places where they could give and take and compromise. When we put everything on C-SPAN or everybody's got a camera, a phone there, we're really harming democracy and taking the kind of rhetoric that we should be preparing to use kind of off the table, and instead of serving filet mignon, that would be Churchill maybe, instead of serving filet mignon, we're really putting out like Oreo cookies every day or something like that.
Yeah, Gordon mentioned this earlier, and I was so glad he did. I regularly use the word democracy all the time, but the reality is democracy is a terrible form of government, and we're not a democracy. Yeah. We're a constitutional republic. So, in the strictest sense of the word, it is good to remind people sometimes that, kind of like populist madness is not good for our country. Sure. We're a representative government, which means we elect people who we think are smarter than us, better than us at what they do. But then that presupposes that I know what they do, and I can discern who does it better than whom. So I think one of the things that's interesting in a constitutional republic is it does require the voter to be educated enough to discern who ought to be, making these decisions. But then you're also trusting the person making the decision. So one of the things that I think needs to happen is, you discern very carefully who you listen to.
Yes.
And part of what I try to model as a parent with my children is, there's a lot of noise. And especially if this is a so-called populist moment, there's a lot of what we might call nonsense noise. You just have to learn how to filter. You have to learn how to turn that off. And part of the reason I love firing lines so much is, I trusted Bill Buckley to get me to the place I needed to get to understand the issue. But I would say 99% of the people that I talk to, I don't trust to get me to that place.
Yes.
So a real challenge is, and I hope I'm not deviating too much here, a real challenge is, how do we, in the midst of the noise, help our children to discern, where to go to find the right information? Because to get back to what you were saying, the forms that we have for communicating information make that infinitely more complicated.
Right.
And they're constructed to do so.
And we're in the Huxleyan dystopia of you don't have to hide the truth in Brave New World. You just flood it.
Right.
You just flood everything out there, and the truth is harder to find than a needle in a haystack, and people eventually just give up.
We've discussed, you mentioned Al Mohler as an excellent source of information and news, and he really churns it out. But, most devices have an off switch as well, and it is okay to say, we've had enough noise in our family. We're going to just do a few clicks here and shut off a few points of noise, set the cell phone off, on a shelf away from us. And we're just going to be a family now for a little while. And, I think in this political season, it's okay to say, I've heard enough today. I'm going to stop with the noise at this point. And I think we all need to do that more. And to your point, Graham, as an elected official who in the State House had a 2-year election term, it was frustrating to me that, you were almost always campaigning.
Yes.
We had literally 2 to 3 months after reelect, when it was a bit depoliticized, to actually deal with the big issues of the state, and then you were back within your cycle again, running all over again. And I thought, I think it is better when we elect people who, as you well framed, who are intelligent, thoughtful, align with us on our views, and then we send them away and forget about them for a little while and let them do their important work, and then come back with a report, let us know. But, that we're, the 24-hour news cycle, that we're always on this. And, the drumbeat about transparency, 100% transparency doesn't allow the Reagan and the Tip O'Neill to go out on a golf course and, just enjoy some time together and say, you're here, I'm here. Can we bring this together a little bit and come out with an answer?
Can I give you this and you can give me that?
Exactly.
And I don't really like that much, but I need to get this.
A little horse trading to move the process forward.
Yeah. Americans think of themselves as uncompromising people, but the truth of the matter is America's been so successful because we understand how to compromise. We have for most of our history. The odd times are when we get to a point when we can't. And it feels a little bit like this. So last thing I want to ask you, and this is, I think this part of it would go into either confession of sin for me or just needing some psychological pick-me-up. And I know there are parents out there that are feeling like this. It just feels dreadful to go into an election cycle. Why should we have hope for the future? Not necessarily saying, we believe that psalm, put no confidence in princes. And boy, hasn't that really, that's been kind of proof positive at some points here. But why can we still, in the midst of something that looks like a tornado sometimes, how can we have hope for the future?
Well, we place our ultimate trust in a sovereign God who is all-powerful, all-knowing. None of this is a surprise to him.
Yes.
And, we learn things that are horrifying to us, but none of it escapes God's notice or his awareness. But I hear the thought.
Well, no. I like, and I'm not trying to. There are real reasons to be distressed. I'm not. I'm not diminishing those. I do think it tells our kids a lot when we have our eyes fixed on things above enough to not let the 24-hour news cycle rule our lives.
Amen.
Because it gives them the hope to be able to say, we can turn this off. Or sometimes we can just laugh at it. Because it's funny, sometimes in a dark way, but if you have my sense of humor, it still is funny.
But our ultimate hope, what we do place our hope in, really can't be government.
Yes.
Wait.
I take that. I think I can get you to take that back. There is a political solution out there, and it's a monarchy that's never going to end.
Well, I can travel with you there.
Okay.
Absolutely. But, governments ordained of God are necessary for, our good.
Yes.
But I think when we place too much reliance on what government can do, we're going to just be disappointed, and cynicism will be the result, going back to that earlier point. Ultimately, though, governments all fail. They all have their life, and history teaches us this. So, but we're blessed in this context to participate, to be in a participatory forum. I think that calls us to engage with it, to be aware, and for some, to take a direct role.
Yeah. And America gives us not just the responsibility, but the possibility of actually seeing change and reform.
I think a really important, this is kind of a device that I use with my students, is if you hold up the Constitution, it's a tiny little document.
Yes.
Part of the brilliance of our founders is to say, let's construct a governmental system that recognizes that government provides the occasion for a flourishing outside it. Mm-hmm. And that presupposes that culture, faith, things that we think make our lives meaningful, that government is a tool that is used to enable those things to flourish. And one of the challenges that's happened is I think that government has taken over so much, and I don't just mean its size, I just mean also in terms of national discourse. Mm-hmm. I think that what you do in an election season is you say, you remember, okay, first let's just stop and remember, government is an instrument.
Yes.
It's a tool, and the genius of our founders was they weren't students of Karl Marx. Granted, that would be anachronistic, but they weren't students of Karl Marx who thought that the eschaton is going to come about when we have the final revolution that brings in the right government. They thought that the true eschaton is the one you mentioned.
Yes.
Christ the eternal King. And in the meantime, we have a form of government that enables flourishing to occur. That's what our Bill of Rights is about. How can we allow people to flourish in their faith, in their political activity, in their communities? And so what the challenge in an electoral cycle is to think that government is the number one most important thing. And I actually enjoy electoral seasons because I kind of view it as a game. And if do I get, excited about sports and the outcome of sporting events? Yes, I do. I've been known to yell at the television once or twice. On the other hand, I never forget that it's a game,
right.
That the outcome, that my eternal destiny isn't. And the reality is politics can feel a lot more like it's connected to my eternal destiny and a lot less like a game. But just look at the size of the Constitution. Our founders wanted us to understand it's not intended to be the gospel. Mm-hmm. And that's just a good reminder during the political cycle.
We're so, Federalist 51.
Yep.
If men were angels, No
Yep.
government would be necessary. And if we were governed by angels, you wouldn't have to set up all these checks and balances. But we're broken, sinful people.
Yep, and there was actually a Federalist Party, so I would be but if I were to create a party, it would be called the Federalist 51 Party, right?
Right.
just limited government is good. Checks and balances are good, but they're necessary because we're not angels.
Yeah.
So the government will always have an instrumental quality that is aimed at creating the space and the freedom for people to flourish. And government isn't flourishing.
Yeah, no, and that view of government can liberate it to be what it's meant to be and keep us out of the ditch of disappointment and despair and apathy, because government's not going to fix all of our problems, and it's not. While I resonate with Reagan's language about government being the problem sometimes, we have to be mature enough to know that bad government is the problem.
Right.
Good government
is ordained by God.
It's ordained by
Romans
God.
13.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
Calvin said as necessary as water and bread, I think, or something like that.
I'm just reflecting as Graham's excellent point on the limiting of it. The words of Thomas Jefferson loom large: that government governs best that governs least.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that is, I think, the wisdom of a founder who said, keep it small, keep it constrained, to let freedom flourish in these other areas that you elucidated there, the other things that make our lives meaningful and rich.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And those things are what we're trying to cultivate here at Veritas Academy. We're trying to cultivate eyes being fixed on Christ. So, gentlemen, thank you. I know that I feel a little better now that I've talked to you two. Still a lot of trepidation headed into this.
Our bill will be in the mail to you.
Thank you
for this psychological help.
Thank you, Gordon. I think my most I don't even know if this exists anymore, but my favorite political moment, I think, of all of my time in Pennsylvania was one night I woke up, and to try to get myself back to sleep, I would watch the PCN,
Pennsylvania Cable Network.
and there was a man that asked Representative Denlinger. He said he was talking about some kind of subsidy that they were giving to some small businesses. And Gordon, you asked the question, but I think what concerns me is it feels like you're just picking winners and losers. And the camera was back on that guy, and he was not angry, but you could tell he wasn't agreeing with you. And I thought, boy, I wonder what he's going to say, because it seems obvious that that's what he's doing. And he says, Representative Denlinger, with all respect, I don't really look at it that way. I just look at it like I'm picking the winners. and I almost fell out of my recliner. You kept your cool, but I just thought, well, I would have yelled, "Who are the other people then?" But thank you all for coming in. And hey, if you parents, I know it's a challenging time to talk with your kids about these things, and our votes, especially if you're listening to me in Pennsylvania, seem to be really meaningful this time. So I think you've got to do some thinking, not only for yourself, but you got to prepare your children to do that thinking after you. So thank you all for coming in. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, please like us, and leave a review. That helps us expand the empire of truth. The empire of Veritas, which has reached places like South Korea at this point. We actually have listeners from there, and thank you for all of the encouragement that you give to us. But it would be really helpful for you to subscribe and tell someone if you think they would like the Cultivate podcast. So thank you all, and we all are, as Aristotle said, political animals. So, and boy, in election times in America, it seems like it, doesn't it? So thank you all, and let's keep our eyes fixed on Jesus even as we head toward Election Day.
Thanks, Ty.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to learn more about Veritas, visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.